The telegram bearing news of her husband's death arrived on the same day. Olivia Jenkins discovered she could turn grief into something useful, though she would not realize it until 3 strangers knocked on her door asking if the rumors were true. Sheridan, Wyoming had been her home for only 8 months before Thomas, her husband of 2 years, succumbed to pneumonia during the brutal winter of 1882. At 23 years old, Olivia found herself widowed, nearly destitute, and possessed of only 2 valuable skills: an elegant hand for writing and an education her schoolteacher mother had insisted upon back in Philadelphia. The fine penmanship that had once filled diaries with romantic musings now served a far more practical purpose. It started with Mrs. Chen, the Chinese laundress whose husband had died in the railroad construction 5 years prior. She appeared at Olivia's modest boarding house room with a crumpled piece of paper and tears streaming down her weathered face. Her daughter in San Francisco needed to know that her mother was well, that the money order was coming, that she should not worry. Mrs. Chen's English was serviceable for daily transactions, but inadequate for the tenderness a mother wished to convey across 800 miles. Olivia had written the letter without charge, pouring into it all the maternal warmth she heard in Mrs. Chen's halting explanations. When the reply came 3 weeks later, Mrs. Chen returned with a whole chicken and spread word through Sheridan's immigrant community that the young widow with the sad eyes and quick pen could give voice to the voiceless. Soon they came in a steady trickle. Railroad workers wanting to write to families in China and Ireland, cowboys whose rough hands could rope a steer but struggled with a pen, shopkeepers who needed contracts drawn up in proper legal language, and women of negotiable virtue who wished to correspond with distant relatives without revealing their current circumstances. Olivia charged what they could afford, sometimes accepting payment in vegetables, mended clothes, or firewood. Her reputation grew not just for her skill, but for her discretion and the genuine care she took to capture each person's authentic voice on paper. The afternoon that changed everything began ordinarily enough. Autumn had painted the Big Horn Mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and Olivia was working at the small desk by her window when she heard boots on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate steps that paused outside her door before knocking softly, almost tentatively, as if the owner of those boots was unaccustomed to requesting help. She opened the door to find a cowboy who looked carved from the Wyoming landscape itself. He stood well over 6 feet, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that curled slightly where it touched his collar. His eyes were an unexpected pale blue, startling against his tanned face, and they held an expression of such earnest determination that Olivia felt her breath catch. "Miss Jenkins." His voice was deep and warm, with the slight drawl of someone who had spent years under open skies. "My name is Thomas Sullivan. I hope I am not disturbing you, but I was told you might help me with a matter of some delicacy." The sound of her late husband's Christian name sent an unexpected pang through Olivia's chest, but she recovered quickly, stepping aside to let him enter. He removed his worn Stetson as he crossed the threshold, revealing hair flattened by the hat's band, and stood awkwardly in her small room as if afraid his presence might break something fragile. "Please, sit down, Mr. Sullivan." She gestured to the chair opposite her desk. "What kind of letter do you need written?" Thomas Sullivan folded his considerable frame into the chair, his knees nearly touching the desk's edge. He turned his hat in his hands, studying its brim with intense concentration before finally meeting her eyes. "It is not exactly a letter, miss. Or rather, it is many letters, I suppose, but all part of something larger." He took a deep breath. "I want to write down my life story, Not for any reason of self-importance, you understand. I am just a working cowboy, been riding for the Triple S ranch south of here for near about 7 years now. But I turned 28 this past summer, and I have been thinking about the fact that when I die, there will be nothing left of me. No wife, no children, no record that Thomas Sullivan ever walked this earth at all. Olivia sat down slowly, intrigued despite herself. Most of her clients wanted immediate, practical correspondence. This was something different entirely. That is quite an undertaking, she said carefully. Such a project would take considerable time. I would need to meet with you regularly to record your stories, then organize and write them in a coherent narrative. It would not be inexpensive, Mr. Sullivan. I have money saved, he replied quickly. 7 years of cowboy wages with little to spend them on adds up more than you might think. I do not drink much, do not gamble, and I have been putting aside most of my pay. I can afford whatever your rate is, Miss Jenkins. Something in his voice made her look at him more closely. Beneath the determination, she detected a profound loneliness that resonated with her own. Here was a man who, like her, felt himself adrift in the world, untethered and unmissed. Very well, she heard herself say. Shall we begin with where you were born? What Olivia expected to be a single long session turned into something far more complex. Thomas Sullivan proved to have a remarkable memory and a natural storyteller's sense of pacing. He had been born in Texas in 1854, the youngest of 4 brothers on a ranch that his father had carved from hostile territory. His childhood had been a mixture of hard work and harder lessons, learning to rope and ride almost before he could properly read. The Civil War had come and gone, taking 2 of his brothers with it, one for the Confederacy and one who had quietly ridden north to fight for the Union, tearing the family apart in ways that never truly healed. That first session lasted 3 hours, with Olivia's hand cramping as she struggled to keep pace with his memories. When the light began to fail, Thomas noticed her rubbing her aching fingers and immediately stood. I apologize, Miss Jenkins. I got carried away. I should let you rest. When shall we continue? Olivia asked, surprised by her own eagerness. For the first time since her husband's death, she had spent hours without once thinking of her own grief. Tomorrow afternoon, if that suits you. I have the next 4 days off while the ranch prepares for the winter season. They established a routine. Every afternoon for the next 3 days, Thomas arrived promptly at 2 o'clock and stayed until the fading light made writing difficult. He spoke of his youth, of learning to break horses and the first time he had helped drive cattle to market. He described the wild beauty of open range, the terror of his first stampede, and the quiet satisfaction of sleeping under stars so numerous they seemed to create their own daylight. But it was the small details that captivated Olivia most. The way he described the smell of sagebrush after rain, the particular color of sunrise viewed from horseback after a night watch, the complex relationship between a cowboy and his mount, built on trust and mutual dependence. As she wrote, she found herself not merely recording his words but inhabiting his experiences, seeing the world through his eyes. On the 4th day, Thomas arrived with a bundle wrapped in brown paper. I brought you something, he said, suddenly shy. I noticed you have been using the same pencil, sharpening it down to almost nothing. I thought you might need these. Inside the package were a dozen fine pencils, 3 bottles of ink in different shades, and several leather-bound journals with blank pages. Mr. Sullivan, this is far too generous. Thomas, please. And it is not generous at all, Miss Jenkins. You are helping me create something permanent, something that will outlast my own life. The least I can do is provide proper materials. Then you must call me Olivia. Something shifted in that moment. a subtle change in the air between them. Thomas smiled, a slow, genuine expression that transformed his serious face, and Olivia felt her heart respond in a way it had not since before her husband's illness. The sessions continued beyond the initial 4 days. Thomas arranged his ranch duties to give himself 2 afternoons off each week, and those afternoons became the center around which both their lives revolved. As autumn deepened into early winter, the scope of their project evolved. What had begun as a simple autobiography expanded into something more ambitious. Thomas wanted not just to record his own life, but to capture the entire experience of cowboy existence, the vanishing way of life he saw disappearing as railroads and fence wire carved up the open range. They worked methodically through his teenage years, his first job as a proper cowboy, and the long drives that had taken him from Texas through Kansas, and eventually north to Wyoming. He spoke of friends he had made and lost, of beloved horses and bitter winters, of conflicts with rustlers and uncomfortable encounters with native tribes whose land they crossed. "We did not think of it as their land then," Thomas said one gray December afternoon, staring out the window at falling snow. "Or rather, we knew it was, but we did not think it mattered. We had our cattle and our destination, and whatever lay between was just obstacles to overcome. I am not proud of that attitude now. I saw things, participated in things that I wish I had not." Olivia set down her pen. "Do you want to include those parts?" "I do. If this record is to mean anything, it must be honest. The West is not just noble cowboys and dramatic shootouts. It is complicated and often cruel, and I was part of that cruelty whether I intended it or not." His willingness to confront difficult truths made Olivia admire him all the more. As weeks turned into months, she found herself thinking about Thomas at odd moments when they were apart. She would see something in the street, a particular quality of light or an interesting character, and think about how she might describe it to him. She began to notice the care he took with his appearance on the days they met, the way he had started wearing a slightly nicer shirt, how he always brought her some small gift, a ribbon he thought might suit her, a book of poetry he had purchased from the general store, wildflowers preserved between pages. Christmas approached, and Sheridan transformed under heavy snow. Olivia had dreaded this season, knowing it would mark a full year since Thomas, her late husband Thomas, had fallen ill. But the other Thomas, the one who now occupied so many of her thoughts, made a suggestion that redirected her melancholy. "Olivia, I know this time must be difficult for you. If you are amenable, I would like to take you to dinner on Christmas Eve. Not as part of our working arrangement," he added quickly, "but as friends. I do not like to think of you spending the evening alone with your grief." She accepted, and on Christmas Eve they sat together in Sheridan's finest restaurant, a modest establishment that nevertheless managed tablecloths and candles. They spoke of everything except their usual project. Thomas asked about her childhood in Philadelphia, her education, her dreams before widowhood had redefined her future. Olivia found herself laughing genuinely for the first time in months as he recounted misadventures from his cowboy years, stories he had not included in his narrative because they seemed too frivolous. As he walked her back to her boarding house through softly falling snow, Thomas paused under a street lamp. "Olivia, I need to confess something. When I first came to you about writing my life story, I had an ulterior motive." Her heart seemed to stop, uncertain what confession might follow. "I had seen you around town," he continued, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Noticed you, though we had never spoken. You had this look about you, like you were carrying the weight of the world with such dignity. I asked around and learned about your husband, about your letter writing service. I did want my story recorded, that was true enough. But I also wanted an excuse to spend time with you, to have a legitimate reason to sit in your presence and hear your voice and watch the way your face changes when you are concentrating on finding exactly the right word. Olivia stared at him, snow collecting on her shoulders and hair. Why are you telling me this now? Because I am falling in love with you, Olivia Jenkins, and I cannot continue deceiving you about my original intentions, even through omission. If you want me to stop coming, to find another way to complete the project or abandon it entirely, I will understand. But I had to tell you the truth. The snow fell around them in the lamplight, creating a sphere of gold-touched white that seemed to exist outside normal time. Olivia thought of her late husband, of the conventional affection they had shared, comfortable but never particularly passionate. She thought of the month she had spent with Thomas Sullivan, how alive she felt during their sessions, how the world seemed more vibrant when filtered through his experiences and observations. I do not want you to stop coming, she said quietly. Thomas, these past months working with you have been the happiest I have been since before I was widowed. Perhaps even before that, if I am being completely honest. I look forward to our afternoons with an intensity that frightened me until just this moment, when I finally understand what it means. And what does it mean? It means I am falling in love with you too. He kissed her then, gentle and questioning, his cold lips warming against hers as snow continued its silent descent around them. When they finally pulled apart, both were trembling from more than just the winter cold. Their relationship transformed after that night, though they maintained the structure of their working sessions. The project took on new meaning as Thomas began to envision it not just as a record of his own past, but as the foundation of their shared future. I want to change the focus, he announced one January afternoon, his eyes bright with an idea that had clearly been consuming him. Instead of just my life story, I want it to be our story. The story of two people who found each other in Sheridan, Wyoming, through the unlikely combination of illiteracy and eloquence. But you are not illiterate, Olivia protested. You read perfectly well. I can read, yes. My mother made sure of that, but I cannot write the way you do, Olivia. I cannot take the messy complexity of life and shape it into something beautiful and permanent. That is your gift, and I want to honor it by having you write the most important story of all, ours. They began to weave a new narrative, incorporating Olivia's perspective alongside Thomas's. She wrote about her childhood in the East, her marriage to a kind but unexciting man, her journey west and the harsh awakening that frontier life provided. She wrote about her husband's death with an honesty that would have been impossible months earlier, acknowledging both her genuine grief and her growing realization that she had never truly known passionate love until it was too late for her marriage. And she wrote about Thomas Sullivan, about the day he appeared in her doorway with his unusual request, about the gradual way her feelings had developed from professional interest to genuine affection to the overwhelming love that now colored every aspect of her existence. Thomas, for his part, dictated his side of the same story. His first glimpse of her in town, the way she had carried herself with such quiet strength despite obvious sorrow. His careful inquiries about her circumstances, his internal debate about whether approaching her was appropriate or merely selfish. His delight in discovering that she was even more remarkable than he had imagined, intelligent and insightful, and possessed of a bone-deep kindness that made everyone who sought her help feel valued. The winter passed in a blur of work and courtship. Thomas spent every possible moment with Olivia, constrained only by his ranch obligations. He introduced her to his world, taking her on carefully supervised rides through the snow-covered landscape. teaching her about cattle and horses and the particular skills required to survive in harsh terrain. She, in turn, shared her love of literature and music, reading aloud to him on cold evenings and teaching him to appreciate poetry beyond the simple verses he had occasionally encountered. They spoke of marriage, though Thomas insisted on doing things properly. In early March, when the worst of winter showed signs of breaking, he arranged to meet with Olivia's father through telegraph correspondence. Her parents had not supported her marriage to her first husband, considering him beneath their educated daughter, and the relationship had been strained when Olivia moved west. But Thomas approached her father with such earnest formality, laying out his financial situation and intentions in carefully composed letters that Olivia wrote, but Thomas signed, that her father eventually gave his blessing. "He says he trusts your judgment this time," Thomas reported, reading the reply telegraph. "Says any man who would go to such lengths to win approval must genuinely care for his daughter. He and your mother would like to visit when the weather permits travel." They married in late April of 1883, just over a year after their first meeting. The ceremony took place in Sheridan's small church with half the town in attendance. Mrs. Chen brought flowers from her carefully tended garden, the first blooms of spring. Other clients Olivia had helped over the months came with gifts: hand-sewn quilts, preserves, a rocking chair one skilled carpenter had been working on in secret for weeks. The Triple S Ranch, where Thomas worked, gave them 3 days off and a bonus that testified to how valued an employee he was. Olivia wore a simple cream-colored dress she had sewn herself, far less elaborate than her first wedding gown but infinitely more meaningful. As she walked down the short aisle to where Thomas waited, tall and handsome in a new suit, she felt a completeness she had never before experienced. This was right in a way nothing else in her life had ever been right. Their vows were traditional, but afterwards, Thomas produced the leather-bound manuscript they had been working on for months. "I wanted to do something unusual," he told the assembled guests. "My wife has a gift for words that I will never possess. She has spent months helping me put my thoughts and memories into permanent form. Now I want to publicly acknowledge what she means to me." He opened the manuscript to a marked page and began to read Olivia's own words, the section she had written about falling in love with him. "I had thought love was a gentle, gradual thing, a slow accumulation of shared experiences and comfortable affection. Thomas Sullivan taught me I was wrong. Real love is a lightning strike, a sudden illumination that shows you who you truly are and who you could become. It is terrifying and exhilarating, and I would not trade a single moment of fear for a lifetime of mere contentment." There was not a dry eye in the church when he finished, least of all Olivia's. They moved into a small house on the outskirts of Sheridan that the ranch provided for married workers. It was modest, just 3 rooms and a kitchen, but it had good light for writing and enough space for the life they planned to build together. Olivia continued her letter-writing service, now working from their home, while Thomas maintained his cowboy duties. Their evenings were spent working on their joint manuscript, which had evolved into something far beyond what either had initially imagined. The project had become a comprehensive account of frontier life, combining Thomas's practical knowledge with Olivia's analytical perspective. They wrote about the economics of ranching, the complex web of relationships between ranchers, farmers, merchants, and railroad companies. They documented the experiences of immigrants and documented the perspective of those who provided services the respectable citizens preferred not to acknowledge they needed. It was honest and sometimes uncomfortable, examining both the romance and the harsh reality of Western expansion. As summer arrived, they established new routines. Olivia would work on client correspondence in the mornings, generating enough income to supplement Thomas's wages. He would return from the ranch in early evening, often dusty and exhausted, but always eager to spend time working on their manuscript. They had established a method where he would talk through his thoughts while Olivia took notes. Then she would craft the raw material into polished prose they would review together. "You make me sound far more eloquent than I am," Thomas complained good-naturedly one July evening. "I simply clarify what you mean to say," Olivia replied, dipping her pen. "The thoughts are yours. I merely give them structure." "That is like saying a house is merely nails and boards given structure. You are the architect and builder both, love. I am just providing the raw materials." Their playful arguments about authorship became a running joke, but beneath the humor lay genuine respect. Thomas never dismissed the skill required for Olivia's work, and she never diminished the courage and insight necessary to live the experiences he described. As autumn arrived again, marking a full year and a half since their first meeting, Olivia discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and trepidation. Childbirth was dangerous on the frontier, far from sophisticated medical care, and they both knew women who had not survived the experience. "I will not lose you," Thomas declared with fierce protectiveness. "We will bring in the best doctor available, spare no expense." "You cannot control everything through sheer determination," Olivia replied, though she was touched by his conviction. "But I am strong, Thomas. I survived losing my first husband and rebuilding my entire life. I can survive bringing our child into the world." They threw themselves into completing the manuscript before the baby's arrival. What had been a leisurely project took on urgency as they worked to finish their story, to create something permanent that would exist regardless of what happened. By late autumn, they had a complete draft of nearly 300 pages, chronicling both their individual histories and their shared journey. "Now what do we do with it?" Thomas asked, staring at the neat stack of pages. "I created this for myself originally, just to know my life had been recorded. But it seems too substantial to simply put in a drawer." "We could try to have it published," Olivia suggested tentatively. "I know it is unlikely that any publisher would be interested in the autobiography of an unknown cowboy and his wife, but the manuscript has become something more than that. It is a genuine historical record." They sent careful queries to publishers in Denver, Chicago, and New York, including sample chapters. The responses were slow in coming and mostly negative when they arrived. Publishing was a business, the rejections explained, and there was limited market for frontier memoirs unless they featured famous figures or dramatic gunfights. One response was different. A small publishing house in Denver expressed cautious interest, particularly in the sections dealing with immigrant experiences and the daily realities of frontier life that rarely appeared in the sensationalized dime novels currently popular. They offered a modest advance against future royalties, enough to pay for a doctor's attendance at the birth, but little more. Thomas and Olivia accepted immediately. The money mattered less than the validation that their work had value beyond personal significance. The baby arrived in late February of 1884, during a brief warm spell that made the doctor's travel from his home 10 miles away less treacherous than it might have been. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours while Thomas wore a path in their small parlor floor with his pacing. When he was finally allowed into the bedroom, he found Olivia exhausted but triumphant, holding a tiny red-faced infant. "We have a son," she said, her voice hoarse from exertion. "Thomas Sullivan, Jr., if you approve." Thomas knelt beside the bed, overcome with emotions too large for words. his son, his wife, his family. The permanence he had sought by recording his life story paled beside this breathing, crying proof that he was part of something ongoing, something that would extend into the future in ways he could not predict or control. "He is perfect," Thomas managed. "You are perfect. I cannot believe how fortunate I am." Recovery took weeks, during which Thomas arranged leave from the ranch to care for both Olivia and the baby. Those early days were exhausting and chaotic, filled with sleepless nights and steep learning curves as neither of them had much practical experience with infants. But beneath the exhaustion ran a current of profound contentment. When their book was published that spring under the title Letters from the Frontier, a cowboy and his wife record the changing West. Neither expected much response. The initial print run was small, just 500 copies, primarily distributed to bookstores and libraries in frontier territories. But something about their honest, dual-perspective account resonated with readers. The book sold steadily, then more rapidly as word spread. Newspapers began reviewing it, praising its unflinching look at Western life and its unusual collaborative authorship. A review in the Denver Post called it a remarkable document that captures both the romance and reality of frontier existence, written with uncommon grace and insight. By summer, the publisher ordered a second printing of 1,000 copies. More significantly, they commissioned a follow-up volume focusing specifically on the changes sweeping through the West in the 1880s. "We are authors," Olivia said wonderingly, holding a printed copy of their book. "Thomas, we created something real and lasting." "You created it," he corrected. "I just talked. We created it together. That is the whole point, is it not? Neither of us could have made this alone." The success of the book changed their lives in subtle ways. The advance and royalties from sales gave them financial security they had not previously enjoyed. Thomas was able to reduce his ranch hours, working 4 days a week instead of 6, giving him more time with Olivia and their son. Olivia continued her letter-writing service, but became more selective, focusing on clients whose stories particularly moved her. They began work on the second book, documenting the rapid changes transforming Wyoming and the broader frontier. Railroads were multiplying, bringing floods of settlers. The open range was being divided by barbed wire fencing, fundamentally changing how cattle ranching operated. Conflicts between ranchers and farmers intensified as land use patterns shifted. Native tribes, already devastated by decades of warfare and displacement, faced further restrictions and hardships. Thomas and Olivia approached this new project differently than the first. Rather than focusing primarily on their own experiences, they conducted extensive interviews with others. Olivia wrote letters to and received responses from people across Wyoming and neighboring territories, compiling a broader picture of frontier life. Thomas used his contacts in the ranching community to arrange conversations with everyone from wealthy ranch owners to newly arrived immigrants working as ranch hands. One particularly memorable interview was with an elderly Cheyenne woman named Singing Bird who lived near the reservation. She had agreed to speak with them through a translator, a mixed-race man who had grown up between two cultures. Her stories of life before white settlement were both beautiful and heartbreaking, describing a world that had been systematically destroyed within her own lifetime. "Why do you want to hear these things?" she asked through the translator, her weathered face skeptical. "White people took our land, killed our buffalo, forced us onto small parcels of the worst territory. Why does our pain interest you now?" Olivia, holding young Thomas, who was nearly a year old, considered the question carefully before responding. "I cannot undo what has been done, and I know my writing about it changes nothing for you. But if no one records your perspective, if only the victors write history, then future generations will not understand the true cost of expansion. They will think this land was empty, waiting to be taken, rather than home to people who loved it as deeply as anyone could. Singing Bird studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You speak honestly. This is rare. I will tell you some things and you will write them with respect, yes. Yes, Olivia promised, with the greatest respect. The stories Singing Bird shared over several visits became one of the most powerful sections of their second book. Thomas listened quietly during these interviews, acutely aware of his own complicity in the displacement Singing Bird described. He had ridden through Cheyenne territory, had been part of groups that viewed native peoples as obstacles rather than humans with equal claim to the land. I do not know how to reconcile what I was with what I want to be, he confessed to Olivia one night after a particularly difficult interview session. I believed what I was taught, that expansion was progress, that we were bringing civilization. Now I see how destructive that mindset was, but knowing it does not change what happened. You cannot change the past, Olivia agreed, but you can bear witness honestly. You can make sure that when people read about this era, they understand all of what happened, not just the sanitized mythology. That matters, Thomas. It may not be sufficient, but it matters. Their second book, published in 1885 under the title Voices from a Vanishing Frontier, was more controversial than the first. Some reviewers praised its comprehensive approach and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Others criticized it as overly sympathetic to those who had opposed American expansion. A few Western newspapers refused to carry advertisements for it, deeming it unpatriotic. But the book sold well nonetheless, particularly in eastern cities, where readers were fascinated by detailed accounts of Western life. The controversy, if anything, increased interest. Olivia and Thomas found themselves minor celebrities in certain literary circles, invited to give talks and readings when they occasionally traveled to Denver or Cheyenne. Through it all, they remained grounded in their daily life in Sheridan. Thomas continued working at the Triple S Ranch, now in a supervisory role that reflected his maturity and experience. Olivia maintained her letter-writing service, though she now also mentored several younger women in Sheridan who wanted to develop similar skills. Young Thomas grew from infant to toddler, an energetic boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's thoughtful nature. In the spring of 1886, Olivia discovered she was pregnant again. This time the experience was less frightening, tempered by having successfully navigated childbirth once before. Their daughter arrived in October, a small but healthy baby they named Catherine after Olivia's mother. The birth was easier than the first, and Olivia recovered quickly. 2 children, a successful writing partnership, and more happiness than I ever imagined possible, Olivia said one evening as they sat together after putting the children to bed. Do you remember that snowy Christmas Eve when you confessed you had fallen in love with me? I remember being terrified you would send me away, Thomas replied, pulling her close. I rehearsed that speech 100 times trying to find the right words. You found them. You always find them when it matters most. Their third book, published in 1887, took a different approach again. Rather than focusing on large historical forces, it was a collection of individual stories from the people Olivia had written letters for over the years. Each chapter featured a different person. The Chinese railroad worker writing to his wife, the young woman from a difficult background trying to rebuild her life, the elderly farmer documenting his knowledge for grandchildren who were moving to cities. Olivia wrote these stories with novelistic detail, transforming the bare facts of each person's situation into compelling narratives that honored their dignity and complexity. Thomas contributed contextual chapters about the broader social and economic forces that shaped these individual lives, creating a book that was both intimately personal and broadly analytical. "This is your masterwork," Thomas told her as they reviewed the final proofs. "You have given voice to people who are usually voiceless, and you have done it with such grace and empathy. I am in awe of you, Olivia." She smiled, tired but satisfied. Writing this book while caring for two small children had been exhausting, but the result justified the effort. "We did this together, as we do everything. You conducted half the interviews, provided crucial insights, and took over childcare whenever I needed uninterrupted time to write. This book is as much yours as mine. Then we are quite the team, are we not? The very best team." The third book became their most successful, winning praise from literary critics, who had previously dismissed Western memoirs as lowbrow entertainment. It was reviewed favorably in prestigious Eastern periodicals and adopted by several universities as a supplementary text for history courses. The royalties from all three books combined with Thomas's ranch income gave them financial comfort unusual for their social class. They could have moved, purchased a larger home in a more prestigious neighborhood, or even relocated to a city with greater cultural amenities. But Sheridan had become home in ways that transcended physical comfort. This was where they had met and fallen in love, where their children were born, where they had built a community of friends and collaborators. The thought of leaving never seriously tempted them. Instead, they used their resources to expand their letter-writing service into something more institutional. With funding from book royalties, Olivia established a small school offering free literacy classes to adults. The school operated 3 evenings a week from a rented room above the general store, teaching basic reading and writing skills to immigrants, working-class adults, and anyone else who had missed formal education opportunities. Thomas helped recruit students through his ranch contacts and often assisted with the classes, working with students who were particularly intimidated by the educational setting. His patient, unpretentious manner put nervous learners at ease, and his own story of seeking out Olivia's help resonated with those who felt ashamed of their limited literacy. The school became one of Sheridan's most beloved institutions, graduating dozens of students over the following years. Some went on to write letters independently, no longer needing Olivia's services. Others became tutors themselves, helping newer immigrants navigate the complexities of written English. The ripple effects of literacy spread through the community in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to miss. As the 1880s progressed toward the 1890s, Thomas and Olivia's lives settled into a rhythm of work, family, and creative collaboration. They published a fourth book in 1889. This one focused on women's experiences on the frontier, drawing heavily on Olivia's own observations and the stories she had gathered through her literacy school. It was dedicated to the women who build homes in harsh territory and raise children in the face of hardships that would break lesser spirits. Young Thomas, now 5 years old, showed signs of his parents' literary inclinations, constantly asking for stories and demonstrating an unusually sophisticated vocabulary for his age. Catherine, 3 years younger, was more physically adventurous, always climbing things and exploring their property with fearless enthusiasm. Thomas Sr. delighted in both children, spending his free time teaching his son to read and taking his daughter on carefully supervised riding lessons. "I want them to have everything we did not," he told Olivia one summer evening as they watched the children play in the yard. proper education, opportunities beyond what geography dictates, choices about their own futures. They will have those things, Olivia assured him. But they will also have what we have. The knowledge that meaningful work and genuine love matter more than wealth or status. That is the real inheritance we are giving them. In the spring of 1890, Olivia discovered she was pregnant for a third time, a surprise as they had assumed their family was complete. The pregnancy was more difficult than the previous two, complicated by her age of 31 and the exhaustion of managing two active children while continuing her literacy work and writing projects. Thomas insisted she reduce her commitments, taking over more of the literacy school administration and household duties. He arranged for a local girl to help with the children several days a week, giving Olivia time to rest. Despite his protectiveness, the pregnancy progressed reasonably well, and in December they welcomed another daughter, whom they named Margaret. Margaret's birth coincided with a period of significant change in Sheridan and the broader West. The frontier was closing, officially declared settled by the Census Bureau. Wyoming had achieved statehood just months earlier. The wild, open territory that Thomas had known as a young cowboy was being replaced by something more structured and civilized, for better and worse. An era is ending, Thomas observed, holding his newborn daughter while watching snow fall outside their window. The world these children grow up in will be fundamentally different from the one I knew. Is that a bad thing? Olivia asked from the bed, still recovering from childbirth. No, not entirely. The old ways had romance, but also tremendous cruelty and instability. What comes next may be less exciting but more just if we are thoughtful about how we build it. That is what our writing has been about all along, is it not? Recording what was, honestly and completely, so those who come after can learn from both our successes and failures. Over the following years, they continued this work with renewed purpose. Their fifth book, published in 1892, examined the transition from frontier to statehood, documenting how communities were establishing institutions like schools, libraries, and local governments. It was less dramatic than their earlier works, but perhaps more important, showing the mundane but essential work of building lasting civilization. The literacy school expanded, moving into a dedicated building that the town provided rent-free in recognition of its value to the community. Olivia hired 2 additional teachers, women she had trained herself, allowing the school to offer classes 6 days a week. They began teaching not just basic literacy but practical skills like contract reading, business correspondence, and legal document comprehension. Thomas gradually transitioned away from active cowboy work as he entered his 40s, his body bearing the accumulated wear of decades of physical labor. The Triple S Ranch offered him a position as operations manager, work that used his extensive experience while being less physically demanding. He accepted gratefully, recognizing that his cowboy days were ending but that new opportunities were emerging. Their children thrived. Young Thomas, who insisted on being called Tom to distinguish himself from his father, showed academic promise that led them to arrange tutoring beyond what Sheridan's small school offered. Catherine became an accomplished rider and demonstrated a mechanical aptitude unusual for girls, always taking things apart to understand how they worked. Margaret, the youngest, was still forming her personality, but showed signs of combining her father's quiet determination with her mother's verbal facility. In 1894, a university press approached them about publishing a comprehensive edition of all their books, combined with new material, as a definitive account of frontier life in Wyoming during the 1880s. The project took 2 years of work, requiring them to update earlier material, write new connecting chapters, and provide historical context for readers who had not lived through the period they described. The comprehensive edition was published in 1896 as The Sullivan Chronicles, Life and Letters from the Wyoming Frontier. It was an immediate success, adopted as required reading in history courses across the country. Eastern newspapers that had once dismissed frontier memoirs now hailed the book as essential American literature, comparing it favorably to more famous Western narratives. The recognition was gratifying, but felt somewhat ironic to both Thomas and Olivia. They had never sought fame or literary reputation, merely wanting to record their experiences and give voice to those whose stories might otherwise be lost. That their personal project had become part of the historical record was both humbling and slightly amusing. "We are respectable now," Thomas joked after reading a particularly glowing review in a Boston newspaper. "How did that happen?" "We told the truth as best we understood it," Olivia replied. Apparently that was radical enough to seem innovative. As the century approached its end, Thomas and Olivia began working on what they decided would be their final book together. Rather than another historical account, this one would be more personal, a reflection on their own relationship and what they had learned through nearly 15 years of marriage and collaboration. "When you first came to my door asking me to write your life story, I never imagined where that request would lead," Olivia wrote in the opening chapter. "I thought I was simply providing a service, recording one man's memories for posterity. Instead, I found a partner in every sense of that word. Thomas taught me that love is not a passive emotion, but an active choice, made new every day through small kindnesses and large sacrifices. He showed me that true collaboration requires both people to contribute their unique gifts while honoring what the other brings. And he gave me a life richer and more meaningful than I had ever dreamed possible." Thomas's contribution was characteristically more succinct, but no less heartfelt. "Olivia gave words to experiences I lacked the skill to express. More than that, she gave purpose to a life that had seemed destined for obscurity. Through her eyes, I learned to see my own experiences as valuable, not just to me but to others who might learn from them. She taught me that every life contains stories worth preserving, and that the act of recording those stories is itself an act of love and respect. I came to her seeking permanence through words. I found it through the love we built together." The book, published in 1898 under the title Writing Their Story, A Frontier Marriage, was unlike anything they had produced before. It was intimate and reflective, examining not just what they had done but why and what it meant. They wrote about the challenges of collaboration, the occasional conflicts and misunderstandings that arose when two strong personalities worked so closely together. They discussed grief, having each experienced profound loss, and how shared purpose could transform sorrow into something meaningful. Most importantly, they wrote about love not as an abstract ideal but as a daily practice. Thomas described the terror he felt during Olivia's difficult third pregnancy, the helplessness of watching someone you love suffer and being unable to prevent it. Olivia wrote about the quiet heroism of Thomas's willingness to step back from his own ambitions, to support her literacy work and writing even when it meant sacrificing his own time and interests. The book resonated deeply with readers, particularly married couples who saw their own relationships reflected in the Sullivans' honest account. It became their best-selling work, going through multiple printings and remaining in publication for decades. As the new century arrived, Thomas and Olivia entered their 50s with a sense of accomplishment and contentment. Their children were growing into capable young adults. Tom, now 16, planned to attend university in the East, hoping to eventually teach history. Catherine, 14, had shocked some neighbors by declaring her intention to study engineering, but her parents supported her ambitions fully. Margaret, 10, was developing into a talented writer herself, showing promise that both parents nurtured carefully. The literacy school had evolved into a permanent community institution, with a board of directors and steady funding from both town allocations and private donations. It had taught hundreds of people to read and write, fundamentally changing the community's character. Sheridan now had one of the highest literacy rates in Wyoming, a source of civic pride. Their body of published work stood as a comprehensive record of frontier life, used by historians and cherished by general readers. They received occasional letters from people whose lives had been touched by their books, stories of inspiration and connection that validated their decades of effort. On a crisp October evening in 1900, Thomas and Olivia sat together on their porch, watching the sun set over the Big Horn Mountains. They were older now, showing the wear of hard work and high-altitude living, but their affection remained as strong as ever. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked, breaking a comfortable silence. "You could have returned to Philadelphia after your first husband died. You could have had an easier life than what you found here." "Never," Olivia replied firmly. "This life, our life, has been exactly what I needed, even when I did not know I needed it. You gave me purpose, Thomas. You gave me love. You gave me a partnership that allowed me to be fully myself rather than a diminished version shaped by others' expectations." "You did the same for me," Thomas said softly. "I was just a cowboy, wearing myself out on work that would leave no trace. You showed me that my experiences mattered, that I could contribute something permanent. More than that, you loved me not despite my rough edges, but because of the complete person I was. You never tried to make me into something I was not." They sat quietly as darkness gathered, hands intertwined, comfortable in the silence of two people who no longer needed words to communicate. The new century brought changes, as new centuries always do. The automobile began appearing on Sheridan's streets, strange mechanical contraptions that frightened horses and fascinated children. Electricity reached their neighborhood, replacing gas lamps with the clear, steady glow of electric bulbs. The world was accelerating, becoming more connected and more complex. Through it all, Thomas and Olivia adapted while maintaining the core of who they were. They continued writing, though now their work focused more on mentoring younger writers and historians than producing their own books. Thomas served on the town council, using his experience and judgment to guide Sheridan's development. Olivia's literacy school expanded to include programs for children whose parents could not afford proper schooling, ensuring that economic circumstances would not limit educational opportunity. Their children pursued their own paths. Tom attended Yale University, studying history and eventually becoming a professor. He married a fellow scholar and gave Thomas and Olivia their first grandchildren. Catherine did indeed study engineering, one of only a handful of women in her program, and went on to design bridges and water systems for growing Western communities. Margaret became a journalist and novelist, carrying forward her parents' literary legacy while developing her own distinct voice. As Thomas and Olivia entered their 60s, they began compiling their correspondence into what would be one final publication. Over 30 years of marriage, they had written countless letters to each other during brief separations, to their children, to friends and colleagues across the country. These letters, when collected and organized, told the story of their life together in the most intimate possible way. The resulting book, published in 1905 when Thomas was 71, and Olivia was 66, was titled simply Letters, 3 Decades of a Frontier Marriage. It was their most personal work, including not just the letters themselves, but reflection on how their relationship had evolved over time. They wrote about the ways they had changed and the ways they had remained constant, about compromises and conflicts, and the deep satisfaction of being truly known by another person. "I am not the same man who appeared at your door in 1881, Thomas wrote in the book's introduction. That young cowboy, so earnest and uncertain, has been transformed by decades of partnership with a remarkable woman. Olivia taught me to see beyond the narrow constraints of my own experience, to value perspectives different from my own, to understand that true strength includes vulnerability, and that love is not possession but liberation." Olivia's introduction echoed these sentiments. "Thomas appeared in my life when I was lost, newly widowed and uncertain about my future. He offered me not rescue but collaboration, not protection but partnership. Together we built something neither could have created alone, a body of work that documents an era and a relationship that exemplifies what two people can achieve when they truly see and value each other. I am grateful for every day we have shared and for the knowledge that our story will outlast our lives." The book was well received, though its audience was smaller than their earlier, more historical works. It appealed particularly to older readers who appreciated its honest reflection on long marriage, and to younger people seeking models for building their own partnerships. Thomas and Olivia gradually reduced their public activities as age and accumulated health issues took their toll. Thomas's joints, worn by decades of physical labor, stiffened with arthritis. Olivia's eyesight declined, making the close work of writing increasingly difficult. But they remained active in their community, attending literacy school events and maintaining correspondence with friends and family. In the summer of 1908, they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with a gathering that drew over 100 people. Former students from the literacy school, now successful in various trades and professions, came to honor the woman who had taught them to read. Thomas's colleagues from the ranch, some retired and others still working, shared stories about his fairness and wisdom. Their children and grandchildren filled the house with noise and laughter. Standing to make a toast, Tom raised his glass and addressed his parents. "You taught us that the most important thing we can do with our lives is to help others tell their stories. You showed us that love is not just an emotion but a practice, something you choose and build every single day. You documented an era of American history that might otherwise have been lost or distorted. But more than that, you lived with integrity and kindness, treating everyone you encountered with respect regardless of their station. You gave us the best possible example of how to live." Thomas and Olivia stood together, both moved to tears by their son's words and by the gathering of people whose lives they had touched. Looking around the room, they saw evidence of the ripples their work had created. Literate workers who had advanced in their careers, children who had received education they might otherwise have been denied, a community that valued learning and preserved its own history. "We just told the truth as we understood it," Thomas said simply. "We did not set out to change anything. We simply wanted to record what we saw and experienced." "But that is how change happens," replied one of Olivia's first literacy students, an elderly Chinese man who now ran his own successful business. "You gave voice to those of us who had none. You treated our stories as worthy of preservation. That simple act of respect changed how we saw ourselves and how others saw us." As the celebration continued around them, Thomas pulled Olivia close and whispered, "We did all right, did we not?" "We did better than all right," she replied. "We built something beautiful." They had a few more good years. Thomas remained lucid and engaged until the end, though his body grew increasingly frail. He died peacefully in his sleep in the autumn of 1911 at the age of 77, with Olivia holding his hand. His funeral filled Sheridan's church, which had been expanded twice since their wedding nearly 30 years earlier. People came from across Wyoming and beyond to honor a man who had been both ordinary and extraordinary, a working cowboy who had documented his world with unprecedented honesty and insight. Olivia lived another 3 years, spending much of that time organizing Thomas's papers and ensuring their body of work would be preserved properly. She donated their manuscripts and correspondence to the Wyoming Historical Society, where they became the foundation of an important archive of frontier life. She died in the spring of 1914, at the age of 75, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her last words, according to Margaret, who was with her at the end, were about Thomas. "Tell him I am coming. Tell him we still have stories to write together." They were buried beside each other in Sheridan's cemetery, under headstones that bore simple inscriptions. Thomas's read, "He gave words to experience." Olivia's read, "She gave voice to the voiceless," but their true memorial was the work they left behind. Their books remained in print for decades, studied by historians and cherished by readers who wanted to understand what life had really been like during the transformation of the American West. The literacy school continued operating well into the 20th century, eventually being absorbed into the public school system, but maintaining its commitment to adult education. Their children and grandchildren carried forward different aspects of their legacy. Tom's historical work earned him recognition as one of the leading scholars of Western American history. Catherine's engineering projects brought clean water and reliable infrastructure to dozens of communities. Margaret's novels, while fiction, drew heavily on the frontier stories her parents had collected, keeping those experiences alive for new generations. Most importantly, Thomas and Olivia's marriage became a model for what partnership could mean. They had shown that two people from different backgrounds, brought together by unusual circumstances, could create something neither could achieve alone. They had demonstrated that love was not just romance, but collaboration, respect, and the daily choice to value another person's dreams as much as your own. The story of how a widowed letter writer and a lonely cowboy met, fell in love, and documented an era became part of Wyoming's mythology, told and retold in increasingly romanticized versions. But the truth, preserved in their own words across thousands of pages of books and letters, was more beautiful than any myth. They had simply been two people who recognized in each other something worth preserving. Thomas had asked Olivia to write their story together forever, and she had agreed. In doing so, they created not just a historical record but a testament to the transformative power of love, partnership, and the act of truly seeing another person. Their story endured because it was both extraordinary and universal. The specifics were unique to their time and place, but the underlying truth resonated across generations. That two people working together with genuine respect and affection can create something beautiful and lasting, and that every life contains stories worth preserving if only someone will take the time to write them down with care. In the end, Thomas Sullivan got what he wanted. His life was recorded, made permanent, saved from the obscurity he had feared. But he got something infinitely more valuable as well. A partnership that enriched every aspect of his existence, children and grandchildren who carried forward his values, and the knowledge that he had contributed something meaningful to the world. And Olivia Jenkins, who had thought her life essentially over at 23, discovered that grief could transform into purpose, that loss could lead to finding, and that the most profound love sometimes arrives in the most unexpected packages, carried by a tall cowboy with an unusual request and eyes the color of Wyoming sky. Their story ended, as all stories must, with death and separation. But it also continued, in the books that remained on library shelves, in the descendants who carried their genes and values, in the community institutions they had helped build, and in the example they provided of how to live with integrity, purpose, and love. When people in Sheridan told stories about the town's history, they always mentioned the Sullivans, the cowboy and the letter writer who had documented their era and shown what partnership could mean. Young couples sometimes visited their graves, standing before those simple headstones and imagining what it must have been like to love so deeply, to work so closely, to create something that would outlast mortality. The question Thomas had asked that spring day in 1881 had been answered more fully than he could have imagined. Yes, Olivia would write their story together forever. And in doing so, they both achieved the permanence they sought, not through individual accomplishment but through the intertwining of two lives into something greater than either could have been alone. Their story became part of the larger American story, a reminder that history is made not just by famous figures, but by ordinary people who choose to document their experiences honestly, and who build their lives with purpose and love. Thomas and Olivia Sullivan had done exactly that, and their legacy endured.